A servant asked His Highness Hubern if he was sure he wanted to use all those fireworks for the birthday party today, since it exceeded 10 times the amount of money allocated. Hubern replied that he should do as he was ordered. The servant replied that in that case they would have to mobilize additional forces to prepare the fireworks properly, and even the mages who were defending the castle would have to be mobilized. Hubern insisted and said that he would reward them generously after the banquet. Suddenly, Claudia arrived, and Hubern said that she was especially beautiful today. The protagonist asked if he was really going to grant her wish. Hubern said that he had prepared a grand finale for tonight. That is, the fireworks that Claudia had requested, and the flowers, dresses, and jewelry were in the hall. Claudia was very excited and overwhelmed by what was happening. Hubern asked how he can refuse her when she asks him for something, since today is her 19th birthday, as the only princess of the empire and his precious little sister. It was a heavenly island hovering above 100 earthly kingdoms that was called Porto. Claudia de Porto's 19th birthday was approaching, and the entire kingdom happened in anticipation. Prince Hubern of the ruling hundred of the nation as king of the Portu had a soft spot for his younger sister, and in honor of that very sister, a week-long celebration was being held at the royal castle. Novara admired the dress Claudia had chosen, for it was sky blue in color and suited her. Claudia asked what she was talking about, for it was Novara who had chosen the dress. The maid of honor replied that the whole world had chosen the princess's dress, and that she had wonderful taste. Claudia asked the maid of honor if she had sent a message to the court lady Prince Kima. Novara replied that of course she had sent a letter, and Claudia also said that she wanted a marriage proposal by the lake on her 19th birthday, and so she had already notified all the maids. Claudia praised the Novara and said that she liked everything about Prince Kim, but she was a little surprised at his carrot-colored hair when she first saw him, because it didn't match her blonde hair color. The maid of honor replied that wasn't carrot-colored hair considered cute, and he certainly wasn't Prince Hubern, but he was still handsome enough, and he was also tall. Novara also said that it was hard for a princess to find a man as tall as her, and at least he should be as tall as Sir Alfu, the captain of the knighthood. At that moment, Damien Alpha came in and greeted the princess, then said he had a lot of work to do and left. The maid of honor remarked that Sir Alpha would be quite popular if he were less thick-skinned, and after all, how could he not remark on Claudia's beauty? The princess replied that it didn't matter, and that was his character. Novara said that Claudia was too indulgent, even if she remembered Alpha's behavior after her engagement. The moment the maid of honor wanted to remind the princess of what was going on at the engagement, then Claudia ordered her to shut up. Novara immediately apologized and left at the princess's command. The protagonist thought that very soon she will meet Prince Kim, and everything will be fine, and she has no reason to worry. Claudia had done a lot for this day, and so she was sure that she would have a great day today. When the protagonist came to meet Kim, she couldn't understand how he could dare to wear a green suit, because it completely contradicted her outfit. Claudia thought to herself that if the prince had a designer, that he should be fired immediately. When Kim saw the princess, he wanted to greet her, but stopped himself saying how could he dare open his mouth before paying his respects. The prince apologized to Claudia for being rude to the most precious girl of the celestial island and asked permission to pay his respects to Claudia de Porto. Prince Kim said that the girl's beauty was so dazzling that not only his heart, but also his manners fluttered to the heavens. Claudia replied that she had forgiven him and agreed to the prince's proposal to take a walk in the garden. The protagonist thought that this could be a cute story of a gaffe that she would tell after the wedding. Suddenly, the prince knelt down in front of the girl and said that he needed, and she had something to say. Claudia got excited and thought he wanted to ask her to marry him, and said he could speak freely, and formalities were not appropriate here. Prince Kim started to open the ring box, and at that moment, Claudia heard fireworks being set off. The main character was indignant because the fireworks were set off too early, and this was the most important moment. The princess noticed that Prince Kim was looking at what was going on behind her, and decided to turn around to see what he was looking at. At that moment, the protagonist saw that the castle was on fire. When Claudia thought that today would be a beautiful day, it was not what she had hoped for. because the situation that was happening now was radically different from what she had dreamed of. It was Claudia's most nightmarish 19th birthday. The prince ran away with whom, and the captain of the night order told the girl to get out of here immediately because it was too dangerous. Claudia started to ask what happened to the castle, and at that moment she saw a lord from the demons who attacked the castle. The mages were completely defeated, and the damage to the island was immense. The stressed-out protagonist couldn't understand what they were even talking about. Claudia came to the others, and the Minister of the Interior was told that the girl was fine, but if she had gotten hurt, things would have been bad. The protagonist asked what he was talking about, because if someone was hurt, the girl walked a little further and saw her brother, who was frozen in a huge shard of ice. Claudia was terrified and ran up to her brother trying to do something. The Interior Minister said that the Demon Lord had taken his heart, but by the great spirit power of the royal family of Porto, His Highness would hide in the ice until his heart returned to its proper place, and so the prince was still alive. The Interior Minister also added that they were out of time and told the princess to declare a state of emergency. Most of the mages were busy preparing the fireworks, and when the prince was attacked, there was no one to fight back. So most of them died, and the rest had to maintain a protective barrier around the survivors. The Minister of the Interior asked if she shouldn't think about it first, because the whole empire was sending a distress signal to the port and had to hurry, and the situation was critical. Claudia looked at the minister with frightened eyes, and he realized that she didn't even know that, and so things were very bad. The Interior Minister said that Her Highness would have to appear before the people of the Sky Island once the situation was stabilized, and the citizens needed to be calmed down, and he could take care of the rest of the matters. The ministers added that the princess needed to rest now. The protagonist noticed that all their looks told her that her very existence was meaningless. The minister offered the princess a handkerchief and told her that her tears were making her face swell more and more, and so she needed to rest and tidy up until her complexion was better. The minister wanted the princess not to be discouraged, but it was pointless, and added that after the princess washed and changed her clothes, she would be able to stand before the people, and if she presented herself in the best possible way, they would surely have hope. The protagonist asked if she could sleep after what had happened. The maid told the princess that if she didn't, how could she help at all? At this point, the captain of the knightly order turned to Claudia and said that he could hardly understand how she was feeling right now, but still thought that the minister's remark was unnecessary. Another home secretary turned to Alpha and said that they were now in an emergency situation, and under the circumstances, they had decided that it was futile to wait for further orders. Alpha asked that had they really decided to eliminate the princess and take over the reins of power. The woman replied that this was by no means an elimination. Alpha said that if they were planning to discredit the princess, despite the fact that they didn't know when Prince Hubern would wake up, or if he would wake up at all. The protagonist screamed, asking if he didn't know when her brother would wake up. Alpha said that hiding such things from the princess shows that they make the princess look infantile. Also, the captain of the Night Order asked to stop deceiving the royal family by making it look like they were doing something violent, and as the captain of the Royal Guard of the Celestial Island, he is responsible for protecting the royal family, and so he will not stand by and watch them turn this tragedy to their advantage. Alpha approached the princess and asked if she had any objection to his report on the situation. There are 4 continents in this world. The celestial island of Porto is above the northern continent. The land where the Demon Lord clan resides is called Zarzis. It is a large, barren island surrounded by impassable waters and inhabited by demons. These creatures, led by the Lord, are characterized by their bizarre appearance and magical abilities. One day, the Lord coveted wealth and fertile lands, and each of the 100 Portu-led kingdoms resisted the demon invasion. Alpha told Claudia that as she knows, the Portu royal family has been protected by a great spirit for generations. Cupid is a magical core with a vast store of mana that has allowed the kingdom to rule the Sky Island and keep it afloat. But the Demon Lord stole Cupid and tried to destroy the ruling Portu family. Only the spirit's defense prevented him from defeating him, and after stealing the Cupid, the spirit used the released mana to protect his majesty. As they no longer had the strength to keep the celestial island afloat, the Portu would begin to fall. The servant turned to the captain of the Night Order and said that if Alpha had been with Prince Hubern, this would not have happened, and if he had been by his side, His Majesty would not have died. Alpha shouted out who exactly died since the prince was still alive, and ordered the servants to watch their language. Claudia asked Alpha where he was when the demon lord attacked. The captain replied that he was selecting guards to escort Prince Kim on Prince Hubern's orders, and he was worried about her. The protagonist thought about the fact that in that case, if she, Sir Alpha, had stayed with her brother, then this wouldn't have happened. Suddenly, Claudia remembered the Minister of the Interior telling her that she was sure she wanted to use all the fireworks for the birthday party because it was 10 times the amount of money allocated. The princess realized that if she hadn't asked for it, it wouldn't have happened and decided that it was all her fault. The Minister of the Interior said that the only thing keeping them going in this dire situation is the World Tree, and it didn't allow the port to collapse right after the Cupid went missing, but there is still a risk. The World Tree is incredibly strong, but it has no magical power and will soon dry up like this. Claudia asked how long the World Tree could last. The Interior Minister replied that if they are very lucky, the longest time is 3 years, and if they don't get the Amour back, the Heavenly Island will collapse. Claudia asked what they were waiting for since they needed to gather an army immediately to defeat the Demon Lord. The Minister of the Interior replied that they currently only had 700 soldiers at their disposal, so it would be difficult for them to repel even a second attack because there had been too many casualties. Claudia said that surely the other 100 kingdoms could help them. The Minister of the Interior replied that if no one would lead the port, then she didn't think they would be able to remain loyal. Moreover, Zarzis Island to reach only sailed across into the Sea of Death. Due to the fact that its waters are not passable, the island had been uninhabited for centuries, and so he was sure that the army could do nothing about the situation. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered that the prince with Kim, his kingdom, leads the strongest army, and since he had proposed to her, they could ask them for help. Suddenly, everyone went silent, and the girl couldn't understand what was going on. The woman replied that it might not be that simple. The princess said that Prince Kim was a good man, and if something happened to her brother, he could rule the Porta after the wedding. Suddenly, Claudia is told that she has to deliver an important message that Prince Kim left her. It turns out that in the message, Prince Kim told the girl daddy how many official proposal never sounded. Then, he will pretend as if the engagement between him and Princess Claudia de Porto was dissolved. After these words, the princess was desperate and quickly ran away. The protagonist thought to herself that this should not have happened, and as the Magister had told her, she should sleep, dress, and present herself in front of people with a shining face, since that was all she could do. Claudia heard Novara crying, who didn't know what to do because people were saying that Claudia had been abandoned before she was even betrothed. And what would they do if the princess couldn't marry in the future? The princess realized that the rumors had already managed to spread, but she didn't understand how she could be in such a situation. Late at night, Claudia woke up and came out of her room to see her brother. The princess started crying, and her tears started dripping on the ice. The girl fell on the floor and started sobbing, regretting that her brother had died and was sad that why he had gone and left her alone and wanted him to take her with him. Claudia was ready to give her heart and switch places. Suddenly, a light appeared and told the princess that this was impossible to do, and besides, she still had a lot of work to do. Alpha asked how many people at this point could still fight. The knight replied that many of them were badly wounded. During the invasion, the Demon Lord had announced that he would destroy the Sky Island and rule the continent, and so Alpha couldn't afford to let his guard down. The captain of the Night Order said that the soldiers who received medical attention could go back to patrolling, and those who weren't injured, let them guard the castle. Alpha realized that he was in trouble because they were woefully short of manpower, and the surviving knights were exhausted, so he didn't know what to do. Suddenly, Alpha heard a conversation between Novara and the knight who was guarding the princess's door. The maid of honor was yelling at him because he let the princess leave, and she didn't need all his pathetic excuses, because if anything happened to the princess, she wouldn't be able to take care of herself. Alpha asked what had happened, and it turned out that the princess was not in the room. That night, a light that appeared in the castle spoke to the princess, and Claudia thought it was her brother. The light replied that it wasn't her brother and shrank in size and flew right where the girl was. Claudia said that there was nothing here, no brother, no guards, and so she had to protect the spirit for his sake. Light said she was right because he was the spirit she was talking about. The princess took the spirit in her hands and asked if that was it. The spirit was outraged and asked how dare she look down on him, and if she didn't know, he impresses everyone with that original appearance. It's just that all his power is now focused on protecting Hubert, and asked if the princess realized how hard it is to keep someone alive who is on the brink of death. Claudia apologized to the spirit and said she wasn't trying to offend him. The spirit replied that in any case, his power alone was not enough to change their places. The princess was surprised that the spirit had heard everything and apologized because of that, since she didn't think anyone could be around. The spirit replied that if she knew he was listening, she wouldn't have cried like a baby, and it was obvious. The spirit also called the princess a spoiled brat, concerned about her appearance. Claudia asked if he really knew her. The spirit replied that of course he knows her because he has been the guardian of the Porto family for a long time, and he remembers how she starved herself for 2 days just to look slimmer. She even refused to drink water so she wouldn't gain weight. But she loves chocolate so much that she eats it every day and then cries to Novara. The protagonist rushed to stop the spirit and said that it didn't matter at all and they had better topics to discuss. The spirit asked what topic she wanted to talk to him about, and the princess said that not too long ago she had asked if it was possible to save her brother. The spirit replied that he could indeed be saved and that he could help her. The girl was very surprised because she thought that the spirit could save her brother without her participation. The spirit said that he heard what her people were saying and saw how the ministers looked down on her and said that she knew nothing. The protagonist got upset and agreed with the spirit. The spirit said that maybe it was true, but she had neglected her duties as a princess, but it was wrong to blame herself for all her troubles, and in fact, it was all Hubern's fault, which the spirit decided to tell her later. The spirit asked that if he understood correctly, she wanted to return the amour and heart of Hubern. All the demon lord did not destroy the heart, but took it with him, and so Hubern is still alive and she has a chance to save him. The guards that were with them probably thought he was killed, but his consciousness is still in contact with the spirit's consciousness. The princess asked if that meant he was aware of what was happening here now. The spirit replied that he did know everything, and Hubern felt guilty towards her. The princess started to cry, but the spirit told her they weren't done yet and asked her if she knew how he protected her family the first time. Claudia replied that she did, and the first port king was looking for a way to prevent the 4 continents from sinking into the dark sea, and at that moment he confronted the spirit. The spirit replied that she had said all the right things, and in that case it should be known what the name of the first Porto king was. Claudia asked what that had to do with anything and what the strange question was about. The spirit said that the first Porto king's name was Warrior, and he could make the princess the next warrior. To do this, the princess needed to tell the Great Spirit to give her his power to save the world. Once Claudia said these words and received the power with which she could save the world, the ministers would never laugh at her again. The spirit said that he also heard about Prince Kim breaking off his engagement to the princess. But what will happen if she defeats the demon lord and saves Hubern? The whole world would probably admire Claudia, and men would be lining up to marry her because she would literally become the most desirable girl in the world, and she could lose weight and become even more attractive. Claudia hesitantly asked if this was possible, and the spirit replied that of course it was possible, because all heroes in fairy tales always become cooler after saving the world, and if this hero is a princess, then she will obviously get prettier. The princess replied that she had never heard of such a fairy tale, but she thought about it for a long time. No one else would fall for the spirit's sweet talk. Even members of the royal family would think twice. Claudia de Porto, a warrior who was going to save the world, and would later write an autobiography describing herself as a bloody idiot. The spirit asked if she wanted to save Hubert, and the girl said yes. Claudia cast a spell and made a contract with the spirit, but it turned out that Claudia de Porto had been tricked. At that moment, Alpha came running and saw a flash of light followed by a sword, and he couldn't understand what was happening. All the subordinates came running too, and everyone thought it was a surprise attack. The princess stopped Alpha and said that it wasn't what he thought because no one was attacking. At that moment, the girl thought that she wasn't even dressed, and she didn't have time to change, and she was standing in front of the man and the others like that. Alpha, as if he heard her thoughts, and handed her his clothes. At that moment, Novara and the others came running in and started restlessly asking what happened. The main character told everyone to calm down and picked up the sword that had suddenly appeared and said that the spirit had turned into this sword. The flash they saw was a spirit that gave her some of its power because she had made a wish to save Hubern, and the spirit turned into a sword, and with that sword, she would be able to defeat the demon lord. Everyone who heard this was amazed and could not understand how it happened. One of the maids said that how could she fight someone if she couldn't even hold a sword properly? Claudia turned to the sword and said it was because it was heavy and it was time to go on a diet. The spirit indignantly asked why a great spirit would want to go on a diet. Novara said that the princess had never held anything heavier than a silver spoon, and there was no way she could swing that huge sword. The spirit said that this is the way it is, and there is nothing it can do about it. And besides, it is Claudia who must defeat the demon lord, because the spirit's power only works in the hands of a member of the Port family, and Claudia is the only one left. The princess cried and turned to the ball saying that he said he would help her save the world. Alpha approached the ball and said that whether he wanted to or not, he had to ask him a question. The spirit indignantly replied that he had already said everything. Alpha asked if the spirit meant to say that his power was enough to defeat the demon lord. The spirit replied that it was true, and the demon lord's heart was almost impossible to destroy. The sorcerers of Zarzis have been strengthening his heart for a long time, and it is stronger than the strongest metal, so an ordinary ball doesn't stand a chance. But with the spirit's power, it will be possible. Alpha said that in that case, if someone not of royal blood were to possess it, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything because the power wouldn't work. The spirit said that if he could handle it on his own, he wouldn't have chosen Claudia, and as he said only people of the Portu bloodline can use his power. Alpha asked for clarity if that meant the princess had to rely on her own powers until they got to the demon lord. And does it mean that all the spirit can do with his power to save the world is just apply a few magic tricks at a critical moment? The spirit replied that technically that was true, but in Alpha's mouth, it sounded like the spirit was tricking Claudia. You're already deceiving her. Alpha asked why the spirit didn't tell her that she needed to master the art of swordsmanship first. The spirit, very surprised, said that they obviously, whether to become a warrior, you need to have swordsmanship skills. Claudia was very angry and shouted at the spirit, calling him a bastard and a demon, because it turns out that he had been deceiving her all this time. The spirit was outraged and asked how she could call him a demon because he was a great spirit. Claudia said that the spirit had told her that if she defeated the demon lord, she would become the most desirable girl in the world, and even said that she would become more beautiful and could lose weight. The spirit replied that what he meant was that if you constantly swing such a heavy sword, you can easily build muscle and lose weight. The princess screamed and asked that could a muscular woman be the most desirable. The spirit told the princess not to look down on muscular women, and if he was honest from the beginning, she would disagree, after which the spirit called her stupid. After Claudia heard this, she started to cry. The spirit began to calm the girl and said that he didn't mean to hurt her at all, and it was all Hubern's fault. Claudia ordered the spirit not to blame her brother. The spirit replied that it was entirely his fault, and Hubern was bad because he had taught the princess nothing, and besides Claudia was now upsetting her brother because they were now sharing the same consciousness. The spirit also said that Hubern had a message for Claudia, and although his consciousness was still intact, he would soon fall into a deep sleep. At that moment, the protagonist heard her brother's voice saying that he was sorry, because he only wanted Claudia to live a happy life, and he could not imagine that she would suffer so much. The princess told Hubert not to blame himself because it wasn't his fault. Hubern replied, that it was his fault after all, and he didn't want her to miss out on her dream because of her duties as a princess, and she didn't need to carry that burden just because of status. After that, Hubern turned to Alpha and said that he took care of Claudia because it was his duty to protect her. The princess asked what her brother meant by protection. Uber told the princess to rely on Sir Alpha, and under his care, she should start looking for a future husband because he wanted her life to be filled with nothing but happiness. If Claudia could find a loving husband and be happily married and have beautiful children and live a carefree life, then Hubern could rest in peace. The ministers addressed Hubern, but he interrupted them and apologized to the ministers for never being a worthy ruler, after which the room was filled with silence. When Claudia and Hubern were little, Hubern found her in the garden and asked why she was not in class. The princess replied that the teacher had let her go early because the weather was nice outside. Hubern asked if she had excused herself from class again. Claudia hesitated and said that was true. Hubern remarked that ever since her father had gotten sick, that Claudia had been coming to class, and so had Damien. The princess replied that being there alone wasn't fun at all. Hubern smiled and asked if she would mind if he asked her to cut her classes short. Claudia got excited and asked if he would really do that for her. Hubern said that he didn't want to force her to do anything, and so she could use her free time for her own pleasure, that is, embroidery and wreath weaving. The princess was very happy, and Hubern said that he did it because, for him, the most important thing in life was Claudia's happiness. Alpha turned to the girl and said that if she did as His Highness said, she would lead a comfortable life. Claudia clutched her dress and screamed, saying, "That did he really think she would be comfortable?" The princess also said that the captain of the knightly order could not hold back and tell her what he thought of her, and did he really think she was a spoiled girl who could not even wield a sword and was only fit to marry? Alpha replied that no matter what he thought, he would never dare to be so disrespectful. The princess bit her lip and said that Sir Alpha had not changed a bit, and that she hated him. Alpha replied that he was aware of that. The princess then turned to the Home Secretary and told him to get ready to make an official statement as soon as possible, and after that, he should make sure that every resident was informed. The Interior Minister was curious as to what exactly the princess was going to announce. A few days later, amazing news spread throughout the port. Princess Claudia de Porto is the heroine who is destined to defeat the Demon Lord. At the same time, the marvelous news spread about the transformation of the spirit into a sword with the sole purpose of helping the princess. Hearing that she was able to lift the sword despite her thin and frail body, many citizens were moved. Impressed by the princess's bravery, the citizens rushed to the castle gates to help rebuild it. Princess Claudia was so shocked by the support that she could not hold back her tears. The Minister of the Interior asked if the princess would be okay. The protagonist thought to herself that she wasn't okay at all, but she couldn't doom the kingdom to perdition. Claudia couldn't understand how her brother could say such a thing. For how could he abandon his people and ignore the royal duty? And did he really think that Claudia could be happy after that? At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and Alpha came in. The princess hated this man and couldn't believe she was betrothed to him. The protagonist asked Alpha if it was true that he swore to protect her wherever she went, and Alpha agreed with her. But even if the protagonist goes to Zarzis, the only thing she can do now is ask for help. Claudia asked Alpha if he had nothing to say to that. The knight captain replied that Prince Hubern had ordered him to protect her, and if Her Highness insisted on going to Zarzis, he would go with her. The princess asked if that was all he could say. Alpha replied that His Highness always honors his obligations, even if just to clear his conscience. The princess looked at him scornfully, and Alpha apologized if that sounded disrespectful. Claudia replied that it didn't matter now. The knight captain said that from now on, he would address Her Majesty as mistress, and if they were going to travel, they had better not reveal the identity of the princess, not to mention that it was the right way to address her. After all, right now Prince Hubern is asleep, and that means Her Highness is the current ruler of the port. The protagonist remembered how, as a child, Alpha asked if he could call her Claudia, and the girl thought that the situation was very familiar. But their relationship had changed, and for some reason mentally, she keeps going back to her childhood. The preparations for Claudia's departure were completed quickly. After a while, the tailors came and said that they couldn't believe that the day had come when they had to make such clothes for the princess, and unfortunately, they couldn't offer her the best outfit. They then took out the dress and told her that she had nothing to worry about because they had made travel clothes that would surely accentuate the princess's beauty. Alpha looked at the dress and said that it definitely didn't fit because there was too much jewelry. The tailors were dumbfounded by this verdict, but Alpha asked them if they thought the mistress could wash the dress properly. The tailors were dumbfounded even more, for they could not believe that the princess would wash it alone. The captain of the knighthood replied that of course he would wash her laundry whenever possible. The tailors asked, why don't they just use a laundry service? Alpha shouted and asked if they thought the princess was going for a walk, and asked Claudia for permission to punish the tailors. The tailors were frightened, and Claudia wondered why he should punish them. Alpha replied that they clearly didn't understand her determination to save the porta potty, and worse, were deceiving her. The protagonist thought about the fact that if she had to wear traveling clothes, she would prefer it to be pretty. Claudia suggested to the tailors that they compromise, and since there was not much time left, and started to give them instructions about the clothes. A few days ago, Alpha and the princess were planning the route of the speech. They had to figure out how to get to Zarzis, and the main problem here was the Sea of Death, and they had to figure out a way to cross it. The spirit replied that they should leave it to him. Claudia was surprised that her friend spoke and asked when he woke up. The spirit replied that he had not slept, and anyway, his power would not be enough to protect a large ship, but it should be enough for a small 10-man boat. But of course, Claudia had to get him up for his power to work. Alpha thought for a moment and replied that a 10-seater boat would be enough. The spirit cried out and said if he had any better ideas, since even one of them wouldn't be able to cross this sea without his help. The captain of the Night Order said they would head south and find a boat and crew. The spirit replied that he also wanted to go with them, and they could make a boat using the World Tree. The spirit could use the energy of the World Tree to amplify and spread its power throughout the continent. Besides, the spirit had a good energy compatibility with the World Tree, and if they built a boat using the wood of the World Tree, it would definitely be able to take them to Zarzis. Claudia said that because if they cut down the World Tree, the Sky Island might collapse. Spirit replied that it would be fine and they could just use another tree. Alpha replied that he seemed to understand, and the spirit meant that they should go to the Forest of Roll. The Forest of Roll is where the giants live, and they grow the seeds of the World Tree. The spirit remarked that Alpha was quite knowledgeable about this. Alpha replied that this is because getting the seeds of the World Tree is one of the duties of a true captain, and since they are very rare, the port only gets 5 seeds every 3 years. The World Tree was replaced recently, so getting another one will be difficult. The spirit asked that shouldn't the giants give it to them, since the fate of the world depends on it. Alpha replied that they wouldn't know that until they got there. Claudia thought about the fact that she didn't even know about it, and asked if they didn't need an escort, but someone experienced in such matters and suggested to choose a specialist night escort. The captain of the Night Order replied that there is no need for that, because as he said, it is better to move in a small group, and there is no need to involve too many people to get to the Demon Lord. It is a dangerous journey, but moving in a large group is quite problematic. Alpha asked about hiring a mage, because once they came down from the Sky Island on the way to the Forest of Rolla, they could visit the Mage Guild and ask for help. A mage can increase the princess's stamina and help protect her. The main character became indignant and asked what was wrong with her stamina. Alpha replied that he knows the princess is capable of dancing at a ball 10 times in a row, but traveling is a different matter. Claudia said that in that case she should increase her stamina. Alpha replied that if they were given 10 years to prepare, he would take that approach too. Their plan is to descend from the Heavenly Island, hire a mage, obtain the seed of the World Tree from the giants, and then head south. Once they get there, they will get on a boat and head to Zarzis. Alpha said that it was a pity they didn't have at least a map of Zarzis, but since no one had been there for a long time, its location was unknown, which meant that they couldn't even guess what was in store for them. Suddenly, Alpha turned to Claudia and said that she had to promise him something before they left. Presently, Novara was crying because she too wanted to go with the princess. She was hurt that she would not be able to take a pair of beautiful earrings with her. Claudia replied that she was not going to have fun, and besides, she just couldn't give up those rose quartz earrings she had received as a present, so she hid them in her clothes. Novara said that they were a good choice, and they suited the princess very well, and since she had taken those earrings with her, of course, she could take sunscreen with her. After a while, Novara came in with a purse and offered to let the princess take it. It is a magical bag that holds much more than it looks, and will even keep the contents fresh for up to 90 days. And so, if the princess brought sunscreen with her, then of course she can take this purse as well. The palace's senior maid of honor had spent a whole day sorting through a hoard of pirate treasures for this purse. Novara also suggested that the princess bring a small silver water purification cup, as well as silk pajamas. At that moment, Alpha appeared and ordered Novara to stop this and took away her purse. Novara asked for her purse back. All the princess needed it. Alpha became indignant and asked, "What isn't this useless stuff?" and started shaking everything out of the bag. At that moment, stockings fell out of the bag, and Novara along with Alpha got very embarrassed. The main character turned to Alpha and smiling told him to get out of here now. Soon after, the day came when they left the Celestial Island, and the captain of the Night Order along with Claudia were starting to leave. The ministers were saying goodbye to the princess, and Claudia asked them to look after her brother. Some replied that of course they would certainly take the best care of His Highness in their absence. The spirit told the princess not to worry because she and Hubern shared the same consciousness, and if anything happened, he would know about it at once. At one point, the ministers apologized profusely for using the emergency as an excuse for disrespectful behavior toward Her Highness. Also, the subjects of the port and the 100 kingdoms expressed their respect and love for Her Majesty. All the subjects bid farewell to the princess and Alpha, after which they left. At that moment, the sword suddenly turned, and Claudia was startled. Alpha got worried and took the girl's hand, but the princess took her hand away. Alpha replied that she had nothing to worry about because he was already aware of the animosity in his direction. The protagonist thought about how she now felt like a villain, but there was still some truth to it. Claudio asked if there was a need to go out at night. Alpha answered that it was a necessary precaution, because the fewer people who knew about the time of their departure, the better. It would be safest to go to the power zone after dark, so that they would not be noticed. Because of the large shadow that the Sky Island casts, this area is in darkness all day long, and people try to avoid it. The protagonist asked, "Isn't that why they built the hydroelectric plant and the magical stone processing plant?" Alpha said that they were already approaching the land, and he would do a reconnaissance as soon as they landed, because today was the most dangerous part of the journey because it was the area that was in front of the power zone. It was dangerous because the residents of the power zone hate the porta potty. The main character was very surprised and asked why they hate the porta potty. Alpha replied that they hate her because the portus are the only reason the place was plunged into darkness. The princess asked that didn't it create a power zone, and obviously it created jobs because otherwise the area would be uninhabited. And didn't the kingdom provide significant amounts of food to those working in the power zone? And the girl couldn't understand why they weren't happy to have food and jobs. Alpha replied that they could all see it as clearly as the people of the harbor. The captain of the knighthood then pulled a cape out of his bag and offered it to the princess. Claudia looked at the cape with disgust because it was dirty, and so she didn't want to wear it. The princess asked why she should put it on, because it was not that cold outside. Alpha replied that the cape was not to keep her warm, but to hide her clothes because they stood out too much. At this point, they landed and noticed that the place was very dusty. Claudia looked around and was horrified because the porta potty she knew always looked beautiful, but from below, everything looks completely different. After the princess and the Alpha had walked a little further, the captain told her that the power zone was in darkness, and so she would often see creatures like mice. After a while, they entered the building, and the princess noticed that the place didn't smell nice. Alpha said they needed to get to the inn before sunset, and so they needed to hurry. Claudia noticed something strange, because she thought that Alpha already knew the place. The princess turned to Alpha, but he told her to call him Damien from now on because they needed to hide their identity until they hired a magician. When Alpha and the protagonist arrived at the inn, they wanted to book 2 rooms. The woman replied that they didn't have enough space to give them 2 rooms. The protagonist was outraged because she couldn't share one room together with the Alpha. The Alpha replied that he understood her doubts, but she needed to be calm because he wasn't going to share a room with her. The woman indignantly asked if they were staying or not. Alpha replied that they were staying, but asked if he could sit by the door. The woman replied that he could stay by the door, but if they were embarrassed to sleep in the same room because of her, they could not bother. The woman then led the princess to her room and said that she would sleep here, and if she was thirsty, she could use the water. The protagonist looked at the room and was horrified because everything creaked around, and the room was in a terrible state. The bed was torn and dirty, and the atmosphere here was quite creepy. Alpha noticed the princess's displeasure and said that they could go back because now was the best time before it was too late. And if she wanted to go back now, they could enjoy a hot and hearty dinner. And she would also be able to put on her delicate silk pajamas and sleep in a crystal clear room. The princess was angry and tried to stop Alpha and asked if he realized how rude he was being now and how he could even say such a thing. Alpha replied that with all due respect, he would rather be rude now than let her change her mind later by being polite. Alpha then got ready to leave and said that he would be in the lobby, and if she changed her mind, he could let him know. The protagonist clenched her teeth and said she wasn't coming back. The captain of the night order replied that then her only option is to stay in that dirty and dusty bed, and there will be a time when they won't have a chance to sleep properly. Alpha also added that she could sleep comfortably now, and if they were unlucky, they would have to sleep on the damp ground, without being able to even just wash their hair. That kind of traveling is not at all suitable for royalty. Therefore, Alpha insisted that she do as His Highness Hubern requested, because it was a difficult ordeal without any guarantee of success. Alpha didn't trust the spirit, because it is only silent at the most difficult time like now. The spirit cried out that this was not true. Alpha turned to the spirit and said that he had noticed that he was silent when he was at a disadvantage, and doubted that he would be able to demonstrate his power when it was needed in the fight against the demons. The spirit shouted that Alpha was wrong, and he would be able to bring everything crashing down on the demon lord. Alpha said that the entire spirit couldn't even reach the demon lord without Her Majesty's help. Suddenly, the sword started to warm up, and Claudia didn't realize what was happening. The spirit called Alpha a hypocrite and said he wasn't being completely honest with Claudia. At this point, an argument broke out, and the protagonist yelled for them both to calm down. The sword fell to the floor, and the princess screamed at the spirit and said that he had nothing to say because he had lied first. Claudia then turned to Alpha and shouted that she would not give up, and even if her bones melted, she would not die crossing the sea of death, and asked him not to come back to the subject. The princess slammed the door, saying she hated them both, and left. The spirit said that the princess didn't even know how to swear. Claudia started crying, and the spirit asked Alpha if he wanted to comfort her. Alpha replied that if he went to her, she would only hate him more. The spirit asked if they were already broken up, and Alpha looked at him with a scornful look. Claudia slept sweetly, imagining that she was in her palace and sleeping on a soft bed, and suddenly, Alpha knocked on her room. The girl quickly came to her senses and realized that she was in the power zone. Alpha asked if she was awake, and the girl replied that she was on her way to open the door. At that moment, the protagonist thought about the fact that she was now even without makeup, but she didn't even have a chance to wash her face, let alone makeup, and also the princess couldn't comb her hair. Claudia must look awful now because she was so tired last night that she had fallen asleep crying, but she pushed those thoughts away, thinking that she was beautiful as she was. Alpha asked if she had slept well. Claudia thought that she wished she hadn't wasted her energy and asked if they were leaving already. The princess couldn't figure out what time it was because in this place, she couldn't tell if it was morning or night. Alpha replied that they would be leaving soon and told her to take the spirit with her and go to the backyard. The girl couldn't understand what he was talking about, and Alpha asked if she had forgotten about their persuasion. In the agreement, it was said that the princess must train with the Alpha every morning because Claudia, they are very good with a sword. and the demon will not sit idly by, obediently allowing himself to be beaten up. The protagonist thought about the fact that she agreed that training was a necessity, but Sir Alpha was a very strict teacher for the knights, and she would not want to hear any harsh language from him. Claudia walked over to the sword, and the spirit asked him, what if from today she would be training with him and he was looking forward to it? The princess replied that she was looking forward to it too, and was determined to surprise the Alpha. As Claudia started down the stairs, she saw a strange stain on the wall and wondered if it had been here before. Douche asked her if they had already done something wrong. The girl replied that the stain had a strange iron smell, and Claudia didn't linger because Alpha was already calling her for training. Claudia was ready to take the sword in her hands, but she was afraid that she would not be able to hold the sword and embarrass herself in front of the Alpha. The captain of the Night Order told the girl to put her feet shoulder-width apart and stretch her arms out in front of her and hold them like that for 10 minutes. Alpha then threw a sword into the girl's hands and he fell to the floor in surprise. Claudia said she didn't expect him to do something like that and asked him to do it one more time. The main character took the sword in her hands, and in less than a minute her whole body began to shake. Claudia, who was barely holding the spirit in her hands, was burning with the urge to pound Damien with it, but it was beyond her strength. When 10 minutes had passed, Alpha told her to hold the sword above her head for 10 minutes. When the 10 minutes were up, Damien praised the girl for a good job. Claudia asked if he wanted to be quiet. Alpha asked what she was talking about because he liked to cheer her up. Claudia asked what they would do next, and Alpha said that the training was over for today. The protagonist thought that even standing for 20 minutes with a sword in her hands was a training session. Alpha said that she probably wouldn't be able to move her arms properly during the day, so he offered to stretch her muscles. The girl asked what she needed to do, and Alpha said she didn't need to do anything, and asked her to understand him because he was uncomfortable talking about it because he needed to touch her arm. At that point, Claudia said that she wasn't in any pain and everything was fine. Alpha replied that even if she could tolerate the pain now, she wouldn't be able to use her arm tomorrow, and so it was worth taking care of it right away. The protagonist remembered how she had been told that a real lady should not allow men any liberties and never let them touch her exposed skin. But Alpha was not just a man, but her ex-fiancé. But still, it was somehow too much for her. Spirit said that the girl should listen to Damien because Claudia was making a big deal out of it, and wouldn't it be worse if her arm hurt tomorrow? Alpha said that the inn was serving breakfast, and if they went to the Mages Guild after they ate, they could make it through today. The spirit asked the girl if she had had a good breakfast. She had only eaten 3 spoonfuls. Claudia answered that she was on a diet and that in the harbor she had not eaten all day. The protagonist thought that she couldn't have eaten a spoonful more, and she assumed that the food would be worse than in the port. But the stale bread that was like a brick and the salty water with bits of vegetables under the guise of soup were just awful. The spirit said that she had to eat it all because it was too much for her to eat, and that was why she had starved it. The girl remembered that if you think about it that way, Damien had said something to her about diets before breaking off the engagement. After a while, they came to the Mages Guild in the Power Zone, and the building wasn't that different from the other local architecture. Claudia said it wasn't how she had envisioned it. Alpha said they have a proper reputation, and yet it's still a mage guild. From here, you can contact the capital and hire an escort. Alpha opened the door, and Claudia noticed that it was too quiet, and the only person in the room was the administrator, who was asleep. Alpha approached the receptionist, and he was very surprised because guests were very rare for them. He then asked them to put in their personal information for what job they wanted to hire a mage for and where they were going. The administrator looked at the forms and was surprised that they were going to Zarzis. He was even more surprised that the Princess of Porto and the captain of the Knights of Porto were going there. The administrator said that even if their statement wasn't a joke, he needed to verify the information. Claudia asked that are all mages so rude? Alpha replied that they probably are, because they don't limit themselves to a position or place. Suddenly, the administrator asked what Zarzis meant. Alpha asked if he meant that the risk was too high. The administrator replied that it was too, but Zarzis had a different magical energy that was different from what they had. Mages wouldn't be able to conjure because they needed to use a completely different technique from the one used on the continent. Besides, no one has ever been there before, and those who have gotten there have not returned. Some explorers want to go there, but it's a rare occasion, so the administrator advised them to give it up. Alpha asked if they could hire someone to escort them there. The administrator said that if he meant to escort them to the entrance of Zarzis, then it was possible. He then used his magic to place an ad, and so offers should be coming in soon. After a while, a lot of offers really started coming in, and Alpha started looking at them. When he looked at over 100 offers, none of them suited him. The administrator was outraged and asked him if there was no one suitable for him. He replied that there were, and the worthy candidates for the venue were too far away. The administrator asked that if he understood correctly, he needed a keeper before Zarzis. Alpha replied that the administrator was right, but it was also necessary that they also consider an escort in Zarzis itself. The protagonist read one of the applications, and she wondered why mages had so many criminal records. Suddenly, the administrator remembered that he knew of one mage, but it would take 3 million to have him escort them to Zarzis. Claudia was amazed, because that amount would be enough for a decent mansion in the harbor. The administrator replied that he was willing to explain where the price came from. It turned out that the mage could do magic in Zarzis and would probably go there with them. Alpha said that the administrator had said that no one had ever returned from Zarzis. The boy replied that it was true, and after all, mages don't lie. Alpha said that the administrator should let him look at the mage's papers. The guy replied that he wouldn't need the papers because the mage is him. Damien asked if he would go to Zarzis with them, since he just called them crazy. The mage replied that he was crazy too, and the administrator suggested not to pay them all 3 million at once, and to make a deposit, and they could pay the rest of the money when the job was finished. Claudia asked how he could do magic in Zarzis. The mage replied that he should probably charge them for such information. But he was in Zarzis, and he is the only person who knows that magic in Zarzis is different from here. So the princess asked that if he himself had crossed the Sea of Death. The mage replied that not even the greatest wizard could do such a thing. The girl asked that in that case, how he could get to Zarzis. The guy whispered that he wanted to sell this information to the guild for a lot of money, so he asked them not to tell anyone. Turns out that once every 100 years, a sea route to Zarzis opens up, and he learned about it from a magic book. The sea route is only open for a day, and only those who know it are able to see it. Claudia wanted to confirm the information with the magician, but he said that to hear the rest of the information they would have to pay, and he could tell them more if they hired him for 3 million shillings. Alpha said he sounded more like a con man than a magician. The guy laughed and fire flared up in his palms, and he did it so that Alpha and Claudia would be convinced that he was a real magician. Claudia said that she didn't know much about magic and asked if it was easy to do magic without a spell. Alpha replied that it wasn't easy to use fire spells, and if he could do that without training, he was definitely a great mage. The administrator laughed and said they were being too kind. The protagonist said that 3 million shillings was too much because her 10 most expensive dresses cost so much. At this point, the protagonist thought for a moment. The magician said that as he said they may not pay the whole amount at once, but they can pay 1 million as a deposit, and another million when they enter the land of Zarzis, and the last million when they are done with the mission. Alpha said he was surprisingly greedy for a wizard. The administrator replied that the fact is that he has debts otherwise. Why would someone with that level of talent sit in the lower region? The mage also added that he could leave the place once he paid off his debt. Alpha asked how he could owe as much as 3 million shillings. The administrator replied that actually he owed 1 million, and he wanted to leave the rest of the money to his family. The magician asked if they wanted to use his services because, frankly, they would have a hard time finding someone more suitable than him. Claudia wanted to say something, but Alpha interrupted her and said that it was too expensive for them, and they couldn't afford to spend that much money at the beginning of the trip. Claudia said that she could just sell her 10 dresses, since she wouldn't be wearing them for a while anyway. Damien was shocked by the girl's decision and said that if that was her will, he would agree. The mage rejoiced, and at that moment, a contract flew up to Claudia. It said they could make payment in 3 installments and he would accept the check retroactively as collateral, and the contract would be for 3 years. The contract also said the final destination of the journey, which was the gate of the Demon Lord's castle. Claudia was surprised, and the boy asked that she had never heard of them. The princess replied that they had never been there before. The administrator said that he can't go any further because, unlike them, he doesn't want to die. The protagonist said that they could pay him what he needed if he went with them further. The magician asked if she was joking because his life was not for sale. Eventually, Damien and Claudia agreed to let him take them to the castle gates. When the magician finished writing the contract, it was time to leave. The girl was very surprised that he decided to leave so quickly. The magician replied that time is money, and then introduced himself as Sybil. When the team set off, Sybil created a glowing ball of light and lifted it up to the top of the path was illuminated. The main character got excited and said that she was very happy to be with them now. Suddenly, Claudia saw 2 small children, and she felt very sorry for them. Sybil noticed this and told the girl to ignore it, because the children are not used to such bright light, because they live in the lower region, and the brightest thing they saw was the glowing lizards. If they continue on this path, they will come to the gates of the lower region. They are located together where the shadows end, so when they pass through, it will be light again. The protagonist asked that didn't Sybil need to say goodbye to his family before leaving. The magician replied that he would prefer not to, because everyone here knows that he has a huge debt, so there's no telling what will happen to his family when word spreads that he's paid off his debts. In addition, Sybil sent a letter home while he was cashing their check, asking them to run as far away as possible. The protagonist was very surprised and wanted to ask his family more, but immediately stopped, considering herself too curious because everyone has their own life circumstances. Sybil laughed and said he didn't need a place to return to when the whole world was ready to be his home. The sky was his roof, and the earth his bed back in the days of his wanderings. The protagonist had been confused since he had to travel alone with Damien, and now the protagonist was glad to have Sybil with them. After a while, Sybil said that this was the end of the lower region, and a moment later, the sun appeared. Sybil asked where they were going. Alpha replied that they would first go to the forest of Roll. The mage replied that it would take about 3 days of traveling. Suddenly, the sword jumped up and said that he finally saw some sunlight. Sybil was startled and wondered where that voice came from. The protagonist said it was the spirit guardian of the porta potty. The mage was surprised and said if it was a magical talking sword all he had only heard of. The spirit asked indignantly how he could call it a simple magic sword, since as he said it was a spirit. Sybil asked to see the sword and said that he knew almost nothing about spirits and wondered how different their magic was from human magic. Suddenly, the protagonist stopped and started crying. Alpha said they should continue on their way until the sun went down, but as soon as he saw his mistress crying, he asked what was wrong. Sybil suggested that her eyes were probably just getting used to the light after spending time in the dark, and suggested that she close her eyes for a minute. The protagonist said that wasn't the point of the whole thing. She hadn't even realized that there was such a place as the lower region. The girl asked, that was it really true that Sybil was born here? The magician replied that it was true, and the princess said that she had spent only 1 night here and it was a relief to see the light. And yet there are people who have had to spend their whole lives in this darkness. Claudia had always been proud of Sky Island and thought it was beautiful and safe and even perfect. But it turned out that it wasn't perfect at all, because the flaw was located right under the island, and the place was horrible. Sybil handed the girl a handkerchief and told her that the earth was full of worse places. Alpha said that the lower region was created out of necessity, and people voluntarily began to move there. The shadow of the Sky Island was here even before the region was populated. The people who maintain the hydroelectric power plant work at the port and are well paid for their labor, while others chose this life themselves, and now here, quite a few escaped criminals. The protagonist thought about the fact that in any case, this is not an excuse to resign herself to spending her whole life in darkness. When the princess calmed down, Sybil offered to continue the journey and told her not to forget to return the handkerchief. The princess apologized and said she would be sure to wash it when they reached the inn and give it back to him. Sybil replied that it wasn't him who needed to return the handkerchief, but Damien. The protagonist couldn't assume that the handkerchief belonged to him and was a little embarrassed. Sybil asked that maybe they could use magic to build a giant pillar of light in the lower region or create a giant glowing lizard. Claudia suggested moving the porta-potty so that it was somewhere above the sea. Sybil asked if the princess wanted to take the mages to her grave, and the best solution would be to just forget about this dark place. The mage touched the girl's shoulder, and Damien didn't like it, and the sword also resented it, because Sybil's touch burned him. Sybil apologized and said that I guess spirits just don't get along with mages. The spirit said that royal mages had no such problems. The protagonist said that maybe they needed more time to get used to each other. Suddenly, the princess tapped herself on the shoulder, and Sybil asked the girl if she was tired, because that sword looked too heavy for her. Claudia replied that it was fine because she practiced every morning, and so she was getting used to it. The spirit replied that Claudia was just too weak, and that her body wouldn't hurt if she kneaded her muscles after each workout. When Sybil heard this, he offered to give her a massage and asked her not to refuse because he had been doing hard physical work all his life, so he had unwittingly become an expert in massage. The protagonist refused and said she was fine. Suddenly, Damien swung the ball right at Sybil and said how dare he put his bare hands out to her highness. Sybil didn't know that, and it turns out no man should touch a lady of noble blood with his bare hands. The mage apologized for the insult, after which Damien ordered him to move away from her. The protagonist turned to Alpha and recalled that he had told her at the inn that this trip was not a pleasure ride, and Alpha had confirmed those words. Claudia asked why. In that case, he was treating her like a princess. Alpha explained that he only meant that the journey would not be easy, not that he would neglect his duties because his first priority was her safety. Claudia said that Sybil was there for that. At that moment, Sybil felt like the fifth wheel in the cart. Alpha said that Sybil doesn't care about her reputation because they both know what rumors will follow a girl traveling with men their age. When the journey comes to an end, everyone will be curious whether she has kept her honor or not, and when they demand an answer, he will be the one to take her side and prove that she has not dishonored her honor. To do that, the Alpha would have to be sure that no one had laid a finger on her. Sybil was surprised and said it sounded as if they didn't need to spend such a huge amount of money on him. The spirit confirmed the mage's words and said it was money down the drain. Alpha said that there must be a village on the way to the Forest of Roll, and he would try to find herbs to ease her muscle pain. When the boys got to the inn, they asked if they had a couple rooms available. Alpha said they needed to eat first, but Claudia said she needed to bathe right away. Sybil watched the girl run to the bath with a happy face and decided that she was definitely happy and offered to eat while they waited for her. Sybil looked at Alpha, and he asked if he had anything to say. The mage asked what Damien's relationship with the princess was, and he realized they had a rather complicated relationship. Alpha said that they were once engaged and asked what answer Sybil wanted to hear. The mage tapped his finger on the table and said it wasn't much because he thought that since he and Damien weren't together, he should try his luck. Sybil's life was hard enough because of his debts, so he always thought he would devote himself to someone who would free him from them. And that person turned out to be a beautiful, sweet, and kind, rich princess. Sybil asked if there were any special requirements to marry the princess. Damien replied that he wasn't sure. The mage said that he was the princess's fiancé after all, and probably knows about it. Suddenly, Alpha told Sybil to do as he knows how, but warned that the princess doesn't like poor men, and she also can't stand frivolous men. One day, Claudia said for an article in the weekly that she wanted to marry someone she could depend on for the rest of her life, so Damien wished Sybil luck. The magician said he felt as if Damien was insulting him. When the protagonist got out of the shower, she noticed that her life was so much easier now because her hair was so dirty and greasy, and now it was clean and smooth, and she didn't even think she would ever be so happy to take a hot bath. Claudia knocked on Damien's room to give him the handkerchief, and the spirit allowed her to enter. When the princess entered the room, she saw Sybil, who was without a shirt, and so the girl quickly ran out of the room. The protagonist apologized to the mage because she believed the spirit and entered at such an inconvenient moment. Sybil replied that it was all right, because the spirit was examining his wound. The protagonist asked the mage if he was all right. The spirit asked if Claudia could hold Sybil's hand for a moment. Claudia asked why they needed to hold hands. The spirit replied that his precocious looks looked bad and thought he could cure her. The protagonist was worried and said that the mage should have told her that something was hurting him. Sybil replied that he had used magic and so it didn't hurt at all. The girl said that it wasn't healed yet and asked if she could look at the wound. Sybil replied that it was not a pleasant sight for the princess, but he showed her his wound. The protagonist was startled and said that she thought she saw his bone and asked if it was okay to leave the wound like that. Sybil said that he used a spell to prevent infection for a while. Alpha asked the mage how this could have happened. Sybil said that he had borrowed water from a source where a spirit dwelt, but had made a mistake and was punished. The spirit asked why the mage had done it in the first place. Sybil replied that the spirit was famous for its ability to make skin smooth, and he assumed that the water from his source could do the same, and thought that he could sell the water and make a lot of money. The alpha and the spirit looked at him with a scornful look, and the mage replied that even that look hurt him. The protagonist asked if he should see a doctor. Sybil replied that he could heal most wounds with magic, but since this wound had been inflicted by the spirit, there was nothing he could do, and he had no money for a doctor. The spirit said that perhaps sparks flew from his wound every time Sybil touched him. The spirit also suggested that the wound was most likely caused by a young, low-level spirit, and that those guys were always making a big deal out of it. Claudia asked the spirit if there was anything he could do to help the mage. The spirit replied that since Sybil couldn't touch him directly, he might be able to heal him through Claudia. That is, Claudia would touch the sword, and Sybil in turn would take Claudia's hand. The protagonist understood this, but after all, no man should touch a blade of noble blood with his bare hands. Sybil said he didn't want to embarrass the princess, so he asked for some money to pay the doctors, and when he had cash, he would pay it all back. But Claudia agreed to help Can through touch. Sybil asked if she was sure. The princess replied that taking care of other people is one of the duties of a noble lady, and besides, who cares about gloves when it is a matter of life and death? Thereupon, Claudia held out her hand to Sybil. After a while, the spirit said it worked and started healing early. The protagonist rejoiced and said that the spirit wasn't so useless and told him to keep it up. Suddenly, the spirit said that he couldn't heal the wound anymore, and that was it for today. Claudia asked why he couldn't heal it completely. The spirit replied that it is not easy to heal wounds that a spirit has inflicted, even if it is a low-level spirit. And after all, other spirits couldn't do such a thing at all, and besides, he can't use the power to its fullest. Sybil expressed her gratitude that the spirit had done what it could, because the mage was beginning to worry that his insides were going to rot. The protagonist asked the spirit if there was nothing else he could do to help him. The spirit replied that this was all he could do for now, and that he would do it every night from now on. At this point, Claudia realized that she would have to hold hands with this guy every night, and that made her embarrassed. Sybil asked the girl if she would be helping him tomorrow. Claudia replied that she would take his hand as long as it took for him to fully recover. In the morning, the protagonist didn't sleep well, and the spirit told her she should have gone to bed earlier, and he knew that was the end of it when she had a late-night chat with Sybil for joy. Claudia had even had a fight with the innkeeper last night. The princess told the spirit that he seemed to have had a good time last night too, and told him not to take it out on her. Claudia went to training with Alpha, and he said that from now on, he would add 10 minutes to the training session for every time she dropped her sword. When the training started, Alpha said he would be busy and would try to explain what to watch out for when they meet the giants in the Forest of Roll. First off, giants hate large gatherings of people, and even Damien always went twice to get the seeds of the world tree. Claudia was very tense and couldn't concentrate on his words. Alpha kept saying that the reason they don't like crowds is because they are afraid of accidentally stepping on someone. The main character thought that if she had known she would sweat so much, she would have taken a bath this morning. But according to the rules of the hotel, all guests can only take a bath once a day. Alpha said that for that reason, they should get some musical instruments before going to the Forest of Roll. At this point, Claudia dropped the sword, and Spirit yelled for her to stop dropping it. Alpha said that, like he said, he would add another 10 minutes to her training. Claudia thought about how it didn't matter how harsh the training was, since she didn't want him to tell her off. Alpha saw how sweaty the girl was, and wiped her sweat with his handkerchief. Then continued to say that the reason they needed musical instruments was to create noise so that the giants would be aware of their presence and not step on them. The louder the instrument, the better. For example, you could have a drum. The forest of Rolla is also known as the Garden of the Forest Giants because the giants take care of everything that grows in the forest. The world tree is their most precious treasure. Depending on the heart of the one who planted it, the tree can grow tall, straight, crooked, and sickly. It is for this reason that the giants take such meticulous care of them. As far as Claudia knew, protecting the world tree supporting the Sky Island, one of the most important duties of a Grand Master. That's probably why people like him are appointed to the position. The last Grand Master Medarf was also a notoriously stubborn person. At this moment, Sybil was loudly pounding his plate, and Claudia was annoyed by it. At one point, she ordered him to stop doing it and told him why he was banging his plate so loudly if they weren't even in the forest yet. Sybil replied that they were just bringing back memories from his childhood because long ago, when he was still a child, he had met a group of traveling musicians. They played drums, beat a cymbal, sang, and danced. Alpha assumed that probably Sybil lived in the south because strolling musicians tend to be found in the southern part of the country. Sybil remarked that Alpha was well informed. Claudia asked if he had moved from the south to the lower region. The mage replied that it was quite a long story. At this point, Alpha turned to Claudia and said that there was something she should know before they entered the forest and handed her a pouch. And in the pouch was salt. When the forest giants hear the noise, they quickly realize that people have entered the forest, and the problem is that they are not the only ones to notice. We're talking about earth elves who will come running when they hear them.